All right. Well, good morning, everybody. This is Jomo Stewart here at the Fairbanks Economic Development Corporation. It is 8:03 in the a.m. Tuesday, August 15th, just a couple of days for my brother's birthday. And yes, so we're here for our almost weekly Energy for All Alaska Task Force meeting. We are blessed to have with us this morning Miss Gwen Holdmann, the Associate Vice Chancellor for Research for UAF. Really the whole UA system, here to give us a presentation. We'll discuss energy issues. So as normal, everybody know, I'm going to try to monitor the chat box, but one of our monitors is down. I used to be able to cast over to another screen to monitor both participants and chats, but it's a little more difficult now. So please, if you have any questions, this is for your benefit. Just go ahead and take yourself off mute, ask to be acknowledged, and you can fire away with either questions or comments. Okay, as always, this is for us. Okay, everybody. Well, without further ado, I will go ahead and pull up the presentation. Okay, is everybody seeing that?
Yes, sir. Yes.
Looks good. Okay. Madam Associate Vice Chancellor, the floor is yours.
All right, sounds good. So yeah, thanks for the opportunity to chat this morning. I also want to acknowledge Erlinger Gudlersen, who is joining us from Iceland this morning, or this evening in his case. So actually Ellie and I and Brittany Smart, who's also here, we actually had a scheduled meeting right at 8 a.m. So I said, instead of our scheduled meeting, why don't you come and join us here? And then he can, so this is a presentation that he and I have been working on developing together with a white paper that's really about some of the Icelandic energy market insights that we think that Alaska could potentially benefit from better understanding. So I think most of us are probably somewhat familiar with the fact that Iceland, has about 100%, their electric power is generated 100% from a combination of hydro, actually mostly hydro, and then geothermal, and they use geothermal very heavily for heating as well. This is not really so much about that. This is really about the way they structure their energy market in ways that the rail belt could benefit from. And so actually, let me go to the next slide here. So just kind of comparing and contrasting the grid ownership and management and how that's evolved over time in Alaska and Iceland, and then how that actually impacts price structure and the cost of delivered power at the end of the day. So, and I'll just as a little bit of as a teaser there, I'll say that Iceland, is a much smaller market than we are from the number of residents that it serves. Not that much smaller, but still significantly smaller. But they actually have, right now on average, sub 10-cent power for consumers there. And so I kind of want to talk a little bit about why and how that is. So,
actually, if I may, right at the very top, I'll start the ball with questions. Ring grid.
Yeah. So the ring grid, so as Ellie would say, this is a Gwenism. This is not actually something they call it in Iceland, but they do have a grid. So Iceland has an islanded grid, and in their case, sort of a physical island, right? And so that grid is not connected to Europe in any way, and so they're interconnected within the island. Every community except for one is connected into this transmission network or backbone that they have. In Alaska, we've got the rail belt grid. They're not that dissimilar. These are some metrics that kind of show those similarities. The rail belt grid is a linear, right? So it goes from the southern Kenai Peninsula up to a little bit beyond Fairbanks here. In their case, they have a circular grid because most of the population lives along the coast. So there's very few people that live inland in Iceland, and so most people live within a relatively short distance of the coast. And so it follows there's a road that goes along around the island called the Ring Road. And so since we call our rail belt grid that because it follows the rail line historically, I thought that the ring grid was a good way to kind of riff off of that Alaskan analogy for Iceland. But in Iceland, they would call it, Erlinger, you can correctly, it'd just be like the grid or the Landsnet grid, which is their transmission system operator. Would that be correct?
It actually today now is more or less called the Landsnet, or Landsnet is the TSO of Iceland. But you know, when Gwen will come into it later to the presentation, that it was the project that formed the grid as it is today. It was called the Ring Grid project. So it's really good phrase just to use Ring Grid.
Okay.
Thank you.
And yeah, and so like a lot of times, Alaskans are like, oh, we're very large geographically in Alaska. And so other places, are different because they're not as geographically, distributed. And I just want to make the case that actually Iceland, it's not nearly as big as Alaska, but the distances like between like Reykjavik, the capital city, and Akureyri, which I view as like the Fairbanks of Iceland, is pretty much the similar distance between like Anchorage and Fairbanks, so really like geographically it's smaller than Alaska as a whole, but it's really not smaller than like our rail belt, kind of geographic region. It's pretty similar. And so I'm just like looking here, a few other statistics I just threw out here, and these probably I have to work with Ellie on an updated version of this, but this is, there's some problems with this clearly. So anyway, though, but the important thing is that, their per capita income is fairly similar. They grow a lot of their food domestically, which is something that I'm not going to talk about here, but I think is actually another area for potential lessons learned. And actually, Ellie and I first met each other in working in this area of like the blue economy space, which is another area around, fisheries and just kind of use of the ocean as part of our economic basis in both Iceland and Alaska, and then really looking at opportunities to support small innovative companies and things like that. So this is actually how Ellie and I first met. I should say that Ellie works for the University of Alaska Fairbanks. He's a researcher with UAF that's based in Iceland. And so we're really excited to have him as part of our Alaska team. So this is where there's some differentiation between Alaska and Iceland. I've been a student of Iceland for a pretty long time. I think a lot of you know me through other hats that I've worn historically, and I was pretty involved with the Chena Hot Springs geothermal power plant. I first kind of got involved with Iceland as a kind of an extension of the geothermal work that I've done both here at Chena and then at the University of Alaska Fairbanks. So I'm really interested in how we can take advantage of resources like geothermal energy. I was actually an Arctic Fulbright scholar. Actually, this is largely, I have to thank former Chancellor Brian Rogers, who I think is on here today, for encouraging me to apply for an Arctic Fulbright scholarship. And I went and spent time over in Iceland. And so I've continued to kind of keep touch with Iceland and see what they're doing there. And this is just kind of a continued extension of that. So when you look at the installed generation capacity on the two ring grid versus the rail belt grid, you can see that they're not really that dissimilar. Iceland has more installed capacity than the rail belt does, but it's not an order of magnitude or anything like that more. One thing that I think is an interesting factor about Iceland, I don't know if you guys can see my mouse here, but this like bit down here, reciprocating engines. So basically what that really represents is backup diesel generation, right? So they do have vulnerabilities in their grid. And so a lot of their outlying communities, like a place like Ísafjordur and the West Fjords, would have significant amount of backup diesel generation in case the grid goes down. So that's installed capacity. That doesn't represent what they're actually producing on an annual basis. So I'll go to the next one, which shows the net annual generation. So this kind of represents, roughly sales. And so, and again, by generation source. And so in Iceland, you can see that about 2/3 of the electric power is generated from hydroelectric. About 1/3 is from geothermal. Again, remembering that geothermal is actually the bigger energy source when you consider heating, in addition to electric power, but we're just focusing on electric power here.
And the wind doesn't even show up.
Well, for us, wind does not show up as in here. Yes, that is true. It's a pretty small piece, and in Iceland, it's actually an even smaller piece. So Iceland has a really tiny amount of wind as well. Yeah, but you can see here, it's 4 or 5 times more power that's generated in Iceland. And I think that this is kind of an interesting fact that, like, you know, even those of you that are somewhat familiar with Iceland, oh yes, they do all these things with renewables, we don't understand how much more power they generate than we do here on the rail belt. In fact, they're one of the most energy intensive places in the world. They generate more power than just about any other country on a per capita basis. And that's actually this next slide, which sort of shows that generation compared to the rail belt on a per capita basis. So you can see it's about 5-6 times more in Iceland.
So Gwen,
Yeah.
this is Doug. It's good to see you.
Hi.
You know, I worked on power distribution when I was in the legislature. And one of the things that gets me is what you're showing us right now. Let me put it in a frame of a question. To what extent does the industries that this island nation, remote island nation, that is far away from the energy grids of Europe and so forth, to what extent does their own homegrown industry contribute to the use of electricity and therefore the lowering of the cost?
So thank you for asking that, Doug. Give me a chance to go through like about 3 or 4 more slides, and then I'm actually going to ask Erlinger to answer that question about the CNI versus like domestic Icelandic small businesses. I'm going to ask him to answer that, but I want to go 2 or 3 more slides further before we get there. But I'm warning you, Ellie, that I'm putting you on the spot there. Okay, so this is kind of a historical graph of looking at energy production, you know, by these different kinds of sources. So Alaska is in the upper left-hand corner, and then you can see Iceland in the bottom right-hand. So this is kind of a historical look back, and you can kind of see, and I find this really interesting. And I haven't really played out the like details, like kind of overlaying like different specific, you know, projects or policies on this. But so this is kind of more a little bit observational, is that they track almost exactly, really, between the 1970s and mid 1990s. It's very, very similar. The curve looks the same. The amount of power that's being generated and used is really similar. But then clearly you can see, like in the mid 1990s, Alaska kind of continues on that general trajectory, if anything, leveling off a little bit, and Iceland takes this completely, the shape of the slope changes completely, right? And so you can see there was a inflection point there where there was something happened, right? And that was the thing that I was interested in understanding a little bit better, is like what happened here. So I threw this one in. This is non-perfect, I would say. So if there's any folks from the utility industry here, it's this is pretty close. You know, there's obviously some variation between individual utilities. I picked Golden Valley in this particular case, basically. So an Iceland commercial customer, and I'll show a little bit more details that Erlinger's provided on a real bill from like these different rate classes, just so that we can kind of take a closer look at it. But just kind of, this is the quick, you know, takeaway, is that the delivered cost of power for large commercial users in Iceland is about 7 cents. In a rail belt, it's closer to 19 cents. So that would be like a Kinross or something like that. And I'm mostly talking about Fairbanks here. And then in Iceland, for residential consumers in the capital city, it'd be about 11 cents. And here in Fairbanks, it's around 26 cents.
So we're getting a little bleeding. Was there someone that actually had a question? Okay.
All right. And so, so Doug, you started to allude to these, the fact that there are these heavy industries in Iceland. And so when we look at the reason why Iceland has such a high degree of energy intensity, it's really about these heavy industries that Iceland made some like fairly intentional choices to invite in and to have be part of their economy. And I think Ellie does a really nice job of explaining that. Ellie, if you would be willing to, I wouldn't mind turning this over to you in terms of like the way that you describe it with sort of the need to really have a stronger economic backbone in Iceland, kind of at the end of the Marshall Plan as that was phasing out. Would you mind mentioning that?
You're actually, you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
You're actually framing that framing that quite well. Icelanders found out after the Marshall Plan that they needed to have more foreign investment in Iceland, and after in 68, 67, something like that, they started. I'm not familiar of why they went to aluminium smelters, as the first choice. I haven't looked into it, but that was the case. That was a huge collaboration between US engineers, German engineers, and so on that shaped the first big hydro plant in Iceland that was mainly created for this one smelter it's now in the capital area, but it was slightly rural back in the days. So that was they turned on, they went into operation in 68 or something like that. And that has been the red thread within Icelandic politics when you look at foreign investment all the time, until today, that Icelanders are always seeking for foreign investments. And that has been, the necessity for foreign investment has been coming and going throughout the years. When we had the financial crisis that hit us quite badly, when Icelanders thought they were bankers, then there was some dialogues here that people thought that Iceland can be an center for some investments and something like that. Then the pressure for investment in other sector decreases, but that of course went south as we know. Now we are, as you came on briefly in the beginning of this presentation, you mentioned that tourism in Iceland has been growing significantly, and is now, I think, 1/3 of our foreign currency exchange in Iceland, and that is of course balanced a little bit the need for foreign investment in Iceland. But throughout the years, if we go maybe a little bit back to around 1990, 2000 or something like that, people have been looking for opportunities for foreign investments here quite a lot, and they established one alloy smelter in, I think, 80 something, 85 or 86. I really have it in the top of my mind. To compensate for that, and they built some hydropower for that project as well. But it seems to be that what Iceland knows quite well, they know the social influences of this heavy industry and what it means for the society and the related jobs for maintenance and erection of those projects that foreign investment that we go. It seems to be that we always look to the aluminium smelters, and they have been quite successful. They know how to operate them and so on. So yeah, that it is. The politicians have been talking about can we do something else? Of course, we know that heavy industry isn't very popular if you look at it. So there are always ideas of this something else. Those who are not favored for the heavy industry and the smelters, they said, okay, let's do something else. And there hasn't come any good something else idea for Iceland except the heavy industry. So we would be very happy to accept those ideas, of course. But as I mentioned a little bit earlier, that now we have the tourism is growing quite rapidly, so that balances a little bit this pressure for this something else or another foreign investment in industry or heavy industry. Did I cover this?
Yeah.
Before we transition potentially over to something else,
Yes.
a couple questions, if I may.
Sure.
So I guess first of all, it's more than just the fact that again we tend to have a pretty diversified energy portfolio usage, and there's the fact that we have electricity for electric lights, things like that. But we tend to use things like, well, distillates and natural gas for our heating. But it's more than just the fact. I'm assuming that they do mostly electric space heating in Iceland. Is that correct?
No.
That is not correct.
There is some, I think it's like 5% or maybe a little 7%, but it's mostly geothermal heating. And there's actually like multiple presentations that we could give on Iceland. And like one of the ways is how they actually transitioned over to mostly geothermal space heating. Like there's always been, some space heating done, by entrepreneurial people like for a long time, but like really making an intentional decision to kind of transition. And a lot of that was, I think, due to the oil crisis in the 1970s. They were still then pretty reliant on imported fuel oil and diesel for power generation too. They had some hydro, but it was mostly small. And so this kind of a pretty intentional decision, and this is why I'm interested from a policy standpoint, to say, no, we don't want to be reliant on these external sources. They don't have any oil and gas, right? They're not like Alaska from that standpoint. They're not fortunate enough to have that. So when they transitioned over to geothermal, they did some very specific and really interesting policy things. One of them was forming this Iceland geothermal drilling fund, where basically they incentivized or encouraged. I'm going to try this on you, Ellie. You tell me if I'm wrong on these things, because we actually haven't talked about this much. They encouraged municipalities to explore for local geothermal drill wells and then build out a district heating system. The way that would work in terms of the relationship between municipalities, kind of like our co-ops, but municipalities and the local and the federal government, the national government, is that there would be a loan for drilling these wells, and in geothermal the exploration is a really expensive part or a really high risk part. And so if they found geothermal resource, then the expense of drilling that well and the build out of a district heating system would be all wrapped into a loan that the municipality would pay back over time. If they didn't find a viable geothermal resource, they would be written off as a grant. And so there was really no, there was no reason why a municipality wouldn't try to develop a geothermal resource, because there was no risk to that. So that was this Iceland geothermal fund. And then from the individual residential perspective, one of the questions I asked is like, okay, so, Roger, so like what's going to incentivize you to actually switch over from, like, say, electric heating to something like, geothermal space heating? And the thing that would happen there is that people that do rely on electricity for space heating in Iceland today, they are subsidized. They get a subsidy. If you don't have geothermal, you get a subsidized price for electric power for meeting your heating loads, right? But if you have access to geothermal and you choose not to use it and you're just using electricity, you don't get a subsidized rate. So there's a lot of incentive on the individual homeowner then to switch over to geothermal if you have access to it. So does that sound about right, Ellie? We haven't talked about that part of it so much.
Yeah, this is actually correct. There has been changes in this incentive system today. As you were talking about the loans that were given to the municipalities to try to develop their district heating system and so on. That is more or less the old thing of doing it. I think about 10 years or so when they changed this system a little bit, and that is, as we are speaking, our probably newest research field. We have been mostly, for the 6 months I've been working for UAF, we have been focused on electricity, but district heating and how district heating projects are funded is more or less our next project in line. But this is totally correct.
So that heavy electric demand really is mostly supporting industry.
Right, and I'll explain that. Yes, that's right. It's mostly supporting industry. I have a couple more slides that kind of really show that. But going back to Ellie's point about the question on district heating. So one of the things I've been working a lot on nuclear energy, and nuclear is another source of heat, just like geothermal. And so a lot of times we have some district heating systems like here in, downtown Fairbanks and things like that, but we don't really think about it being economic to build out new or retrofit new district heating systems. If we wanted to do something like nuclear in a community like Nome or someplace like that, the idea of taking advantage of that heat is a really important part of like maximizing the economic benefit from a resource like that. And one of the questions I have, these are these questions, right, that I'm posing to Ellie now, is like, we think of building out of a district heating system as totally expensive and just something that's cost prohibitive, But in Iceland, they do it all the time. I've gone to these small district heating, systems that a farmer operates and installs for his neighbors and things like that. They make it pretty simple. And so my question is like, really, what do those look like, especially in municipalities? What are the costs involved? What are some of the lessons learned? So he's going to work on it.
Well, I don't want to get in trouble with funder. But yeah, part of the inhibitor with district heating was actually the way that the provider was pricing the commodity less than the actual cost of expanding the distribution system. That was the major inhibitor. That's one of the reasons that BDC actually helps support expansion of natural gas as opposed to expanding the district heating system.
Yeah.
I would only say that for you, Ellie, I do wonder regarding heavy industry and its negative connotations or negative perceptions, how much of that is based on, again, part of the fuels that are used to do, at least here in the United States, to do that heavy industry. Again, it's more, I wonder if it's less about the making of the cars than the visions of the giant smokestacks that had gone along with it.
And they don't have that here, right? So that's a totally different thing for them. So
We do have a question from Doug, and then I'll shut up.
Go ahead, Doug.
Hey, thanks. I was intrigued by Ellie. You were saying that, and when I was in Iceland, I heard the same, and that was a decade ago, that they wanted to get away from the smelters. And you use tourism as an option that is favorable to a lot of people. My question is kind of threefold. Generally, the first two are, but what does that do to the wages of the people? Generally, isn't that a lower cost wage? And how stable is that as far as an energy consumer on the grid? Or stable as a market itself, because when Europe, or America, the price of the dollar or the euro, that seems to affect us a lot. But really, when it comes to power generation, does tourism use the same amount of energy? Because we all know that when you build these big hydroelectric dams or other geothermal plants, or for us diesel or coal power plants, that costs money. Even LNG plants, and Anchorage is having a tizzy with that right now because they don't have the same amount of consumption as they did. How does that play in Iceland on the economies of power generation?
Yeah, okay. I'll try to grab it.
He does that to us too, boss.
You're right. Tourism, the foreign exchange that you get from tourism is by far not as secured or reliable and good source of foreign exchange as if you compare it to the smelters. No, you just look at the pandemic. Tourism vanished just overnight or 2 nights or whatever. These smelters are, they are picking up 7. I was looking it up to have it precise, during this talk. The heavy industry uses 77% of generated electricity in Iceland. So there isn't any significant or measurable rise in, if I got that question right, in electrical consumption due to tourism, due to people as particular. But they have though been looking into trying to electrify the harbors, or have to establish high voltage connections for the cruise liners and get them obligated to get connected. And I had a short presentation earlier this year on that. But cruise liners here are only for 4 months a year, and they are maybe, I think, what, 2 megawatts connections or something like that for one cruise liner, or even larger, like a small community. So that is a really what's unreliable source of compared to the steady 77% of all the generation that is used up by the heavy industry. So Icelanders, I've been saying with Gwen, and she pointed out to me as well, that Icelanders have been in this quite love-hate relationship with their heavy industry. I have to admit that. Did I cover the questions?
Yeah,
properly?
Thanks. And Doug, just to kind of also just follow up on what Ellie's saying, you know, I don't think that the tourism industry uses it has the same energy intensity as the aluminum smelters, but one of the challenges that Iceland's running into now is that they're actually becoming energy constrained. Like, despite the fact they produce so much power, they're actually constrained in terms of additional growth, like in the tourism industry or other, you know, sort of local domestic industries. And so one of the conversations that's happening there is like, you know, do we need to build new generation, or is the easiest way to kind of free up capacity to, you know, kick some of this heavy industry off the island, you know, so we can free up some power that we can use for other things, you know, other than just heavy industry. So, you know, that's like one of the kinds of conversations, right? And so they've also renegotiated their contracts, their power purchase contracts with those heavy industry consumers over time too. But like Ellie's saying, it's a complicated thing. And so the takeaway from this presentation, by the way, is not that I think that we should have a bunch of aluminum smelters in Alaska, right? There's other ways that we can look at adding load, or, you know, new load and stuff like that. So I just want to kind of make that case, you know, and it may be that if Iceland had this decision point to make today, they may have chosen to do something different, right? We can't know that, right? But at that time, that was the option that they went with. And the interesting thing is, like, a lot of this aluminum, this bauxite ore, it's being delivered, like, it's not coming from Iceland, right? It's not mined in Iceland. It's coming from places like as far away as Australia, and being shipped all the way to Iceland just because of this long-term, you know, low-cost power contract. So it's a real win-win for both, or it has been historically, because it's a win for the aluminum smelting industry to say, yeah, we're going to invest in Iceland because we have a 20-year power purchase contract for, you know, sub 5-cent power or something like this, right? And then for the Icelandic government, they know that they have this source of like foreign investment and, you know, things like that, that then the Icelandic population is benefiting from in numerous different ways, right? So
do those cargo ships coming in and out for the aluminum industry, do they hook up to shore power?
oh man, that's a great question. Ellie says no.
Yeah, that's a great question. I want to add on what Gwen was saying, that, you know, it's the tendency of the national power company now is to make shorter agreements with the aluminum smelting industry regarding their energy prices. They're always getting shorter and shorter and shorter in time. I think the first contracts were maybe 30 years long, or even longer. I could look into it, but they are the time span of each contract is getting shorter and shorter. And of course, that is probably good. That would raise the prices. And she is also 100% correct on, you know, all energy. It's constantly in the news here that all energy is just sold out. And Icelanders are only buying EVs today. I think 90 if you exclude the trucks and those things, because they haven't been developed so properly. But, you know, for families and other purposes, Icelanders are only buying EVs. So that will just increase the demand for more electricity. And I really doubt that they would seriously think of kicking out any of the smelters out of the country, but that will help getting higher price from them for those 77% of the generated electricity that we have. And just recently, 2 months ago, they have plans and drawings, and everything was ready to go for, I think, 35 megawatt generation, hydroelectric plant here in Iceland, but they got backed down by the authority because there was something in the decision making that wasn't right, and that is just a serious step because I think the manager of the National Power Company told in the news here last week that 90 energy is just sold out. There is nothing left in the system.
So I did think that was a little bit, that makes sense. The fact that you might want to reduce use by industrial users if you have growing demand by your residents for that power. It did seem a little strange to me that you all might consider letting go of the bird in hand for a bird in the bush that you weren't even sure was there.
Well, and just to be clear that is not, yeah, like
Okay.
Ellie is the expert. So like you're saying, there's, but I mean, the question does come, like, do we build another large, Icelanders care a lot about their natural environment, right? And that's actually goes hand in hand with tourism, which they're trying to continue to grow, right? Which is that you can't build a dam at some of these like beautiful, natural sites, right? And so there's some limitations in terms of what Icelanders want to do to build out new hydroelectric facilities. So the question is, like, do we continue to build more, or are there other ways to restructure our market? And like Ellie is saying, like actually just raising cost or raising the price is one opportunity. Because one thing, and see, this is, I like having Ellie here because I get to say all these things and then he gets to agree or disagree. Icelanders are actually pretty wasteful when it comes to energy. And one thing I had to get like very used to when I was over in Iceland and lived there for a while is like how wasteful Icelanders are. Like, if it's too warm in your house, you just open all the windows, right? You don't think about turning down the thermostat, right? Like Icelanders are quite wasteful when it comes to energy. So I think that now there's also a lot more discussion about like, can we be more conservative? Like, should we be more, like conservative of these natural resources that we're stewards of? And these are kinds of cultural conversations that like we have all over the world, but Icelanders are also sort of engaging in. So
I love that because that is never
Yeah.
the visual that I have had.
I know people think of it as, oh, this is play, but they're very wasteful. Like the water that they dump into the ocean off of some of these geothermal plants is hotter than the water that we're using to generate power from Chino Hot Springs, right? Like they could do more, but they don't have to. They don't need to because they have such inexpensive energy, right? So
Keeps the Cheetah River ice free.
yeah, exactly.
We did have first of all, this is a wonder. No, Doug.
Well, I was just wanting to say it doesn't make
no,
sense.
Doug, Patrice has had her hand up for a while, but we'll get back to you.
Yeah.
Miss Lee. Okay, Mr. Kraft.
Good morning. I was muted, sorry. Good morning, Gwen and Early, thank you for being here. I put my question into the chat, but it revolves around, could you describe the types of geothermal in terms of deep or shallow, isotopic? What is the main type of geothermal produced in Iceland?
So I think Iceland is really fortunate in that they have, from a geologic standpoint, they have a kind of like a convergence of two factors. Number one, they're on like a hot spot. So sort of like Iceland is on like a global hotspot, or Hawaii is, or like what is it in the lower 48 that Yellowstone. Thank you. I'm like, I kept on wanting to say Yellowknife, and I'm like, no, that's not right. Yellowstone. Yeah, it's like on these sort of like just these hot spots where there's like heat closer to the surface, and they're also on the North Atlantic. They're on a spreading zone. So that's an area of very thin crust because it's a spreading zone. That we see along the Pacific Rim. There's like a lot of volcanic activity. So they're also on this sort of spreading zone. The crust is very thin. They have like basically heat incredibly close to the surface almost everywhere, not everywhere, but in most parts of the island. And so they're really, really fortunate in being able to like access some of these very, very high temperature geothermal resources and very distributed across the country as a whole. And so that's a huge asset and advantage for them that's almost unique for Iceland. There are very few places that have like that convergence of factors. And then you asked too about this particular hydroelectric facility that's under construction here. This is the Karenhooker Dam. So that number 4,600 gigawatt hours annual probably doesn't mean much to most of us, like even for me. That's essentially the amount of power that the entire rail belt uses. And this is the largest dam of its category anywhere in Europe, as I understand. So like these are quite large facilities. This is much larger than Susitna, Wantana would be, for example. So
Wow. Okay, Mike Kraft.
Yeah, thank you, Jomo. Nice presentation. I appreciate it. My question is, I'm hearing you say that you're short on power in Iceland. And at the same time, you're talking about the fact that they've got this geothermal resource and that they are concerned about the environment with respect to dams. So why would they not focus their generation capacity on additional geothermal resources? Is that not environmentally more sound, a more sound approach than, say, building dams?
Yeah, I can take that one. You're correct. But it's generally accepted, I think, that the geothermal power is maybe, is it what, 20% more expensive than hydro or something like that, 20-30%. Just with the construction, that will reflect in the prices. But that is was also during the construction or the decision-making process of this project that you see on the slide here, Kárahnjúkar. People thought that this would probably be, because this project was so enormous big, and of course it split the nation up in half, two halves, pro and con for the project. So people are talking about if we could go, why don't we focus on geothermal? But with notice of environmental effects and so on, of course you're right, but there are though some pipes, and there is a lot of area that get used up by pipings and drilling and so on. And I think that I'm not an expert on geothermal electrical generation though, but it is expensive. They are expensive choices. Hydro is quite much cheaper, so that is always the first choice. But this is a heavy debate now, and has been here since this project that you're looking at there was erected. What to do, and yeah, we haven't found the answer.
So what I'm hearing is that the expense of geothermal is higher than the expense of hydroelectric, and people are basically voting with their wallets.
Yes.
And that the environmental stuff has a price for conservation.
Yeah.
And the geothermal, and like maybe I'll just buzz through a few more slides. I think this is an awesome conversation, by the way. But the other thing about geothermal is it's fairly complex to manage the geothermal, because like I've been a little bit more tied into the geothermal industry in Iceland. They are renewable resources from the perspective of that this is heat from the earth that's being replenished, but you do need a source of water, and sort of like kind of replenishing that aquifer and making sure that you have it. Developing in a sustainable way is actually pretty tricky when it comes to geothermal. So there's a lot more complexities in terms of like field management, these kinds of things. So like over time, I think the cost of operations and maintenance costs are also quite a lot higher for geothermal than hydro. So I think there's a few factors there probably.
By the way, everybody, I think we're going to go ahead and buzz through. This is a wonderful, robust discussion.
Yeah, I like it.
We'll see if we can sit through some slides.
Been talked about. So Ellie mentioned that like over 3/4 of electricity production in Iceland is for this C&I, this commercial and industrial industry. I actually broke this out. Ellie, we haven't talked about some of these slides, but I pulled out the C&I industry out of that pie chart. And when you look at that, the per capita annual generation for Iceland and the rail belt is almost identical. So again, it's really that C&I industry that's like really the bigger, that's that big piece. Other than that, they're not too dissimilar from where we are. Okay, so actually, this has been a really great conversation. The original purpose of this presentation is talking a little bit about the grid and how they sort of built up their grid infrastructure. And this is actually a story that I think is super relevant to the rail belt and some of the conversations we've had today, because the way they've evolved the grid infrastructure and then the ownership model really closely tracks Alaska up into a point. And this is kind of one of the things I've been sharing with the utility industry here a bit, because there's some interest in this. So back in the 70s, there was like sort of these 4 different independent kind of, I don't know, mini grids, like a little regional grids in Iceland that were built up around these like 4 population centers. So like kind of that capital area in Southwest Alaska, the West Fjords up in, which that's actually the oldest, that's kind of toward Greenland, basically toward the Greenland side. That's from a geologic standpoint, that's the oldest part of Iceland. They don't have a lot of geothermal resources there compared to other places. So there's actually cost implications that we'll kind of talk about in a minute. The north, this is like the north here is like Fairbanks of our rail belt grid. It's like Akureyri is the largest city there, and then there's like quite a bit happening in the north. And then this eastern area, Egilsstadir, that's like where that Karenhooker Dam is kind of like feeding into some of the industrial loads on that side. So what wound up happening, and that was not built at the time, just to be clear, but I'm just saying, like from a population standpoint, they made these, kind of practical decisions. And one of them was like, we actually need to connect these different load centers to build like a transmission network. If we're going to be building up additional generation, if we're really looking at how to modernize our grid, we need to do this. And so what they did is like these individual isolated grids and the generation stations were owned by mostly local municipalities or farmers that were, building a small hydro facility or something like that. And this might also kind of, Iceland has a real diversity in terms of hydroelectric, like everything from tiny, tens of kilowatt, small run of river hydro facilities that are independent power producers to these like ginormous dams, right? So there's like a lot of different, hydro is not monolithic in Iceland. There's like a lot of diversity there. So there was a lot of, hydro and diesel-based power in these small regional grids. The 1970s, the oil crisis really was an impetus to say we want to figure out how to modernize our grid, take more advantage of our renewable resources. Interconnecting the grid was a first step. And so there was actually a state energy company that was formed called Landsverken that initially owned and operated, or basically was the entity that built out or owned these transmission grids. The regional grids were still owned by like local municipalities, or this kind of patchwork of ownership. I'm going to just keep going, and then you tell me where I'm wrong here, Ellie, afterwards. So just going to the next slide, because we don't have that much time.
But that kind of explains, that same pattern explains why, let's say GVA has the inventory it has.
So
it was disconnected for a long time.
Yeah. How do I, okay. Oh my goodness. Okay. So there's some delay here, and it's okay. All right. Sorry about that. I'm going to just take some time here. So basically that structure is pretty similar to what we have here right now. So basically this Landsverken owned these key transmission assets that were connecting these regional grids and some of these large hydro facilities like that Karenhooker Dam, for example. So it's just like right now, Alaska Energy Authority owns key pieces of our transmission network, like the Alaska Intertie that actually brings power from the south to the north that connects our grid, and then other assets like the Bradley Hydroelectric Facility that were too big for any one utility to kind of take on. So this is really similar to how Alaska is structured today, but then they didn't stop here. So Ellie, I'm going to keep going. Is there anything there that I said that was wrong or that you want to add to?
You're so far spot on.
Okay, so what happened then is, Iceland has this interesting relationship with the European Union. They're not part of the EU, Okay, but they're part of the European kind of economic zone, right? And so they're part of this EFTA, this European Free Trade Association that includes like, you know, Norway and Switzerland and I think Liechtenstein or something like that, right? And so the deal is there that they can benefit from being part of like the internal European market in exchange for adopting certain EU regulations in certain, you know, areas. And one of them is energy regulation. And so Iceland was pretty happy with this model they had before. They weren't looking to change it. But then the European Union made this big push to kind of deregulate and unbundle the generation and transmission assets in Europe. And Iceland had to follow suit. They didn't really have a choice. They weren't necessarily excited to do it, but they were sort of pushed into this because in order to be part of the European economic zone, they needed to adopt these kinds of regulations. And so this was done over a number of different sort of stages over about a decade. And really it's actually just being finalized even as late as this year in terms of like ownership transfer. And so what this meant is that they had that initial state energy company, like their version of kind of the Alaska Energy Authority, one of the functions of that, Landsvirkjun. They had to split out the transmission assets, and that became the second kind of state, kind of quasi-state owned entity called Landsnet. That's the transmission system operator for Iceland and still is today. In Europe, the way that this kind of worked more broadly, and so initially Iceland was kind of following that European model, the previous owners of those transmission assets then had shares in that transmission company, that corporation. So in Norway, for example, I've spent a bit of time in Norway. That's the way it is today, that the municipalities own a piece of the transmission company, and they actually, it's a for-profit entity, and they rely on that for some of the revenue that they use for their municipal budgets and things like that. Iceland took a step further beyond that, and they basically ultimately transferred all of those assets to like a nonprofit, you know, state ownership. So they've now kind of moved the ownership, and I'm just kind of running through this because we're in a little bit of a hurry. I took out those slides, Ellie, on the maybe they're in here, I don't know. But yeah, right here. Okay, asset ownership for the transmission. So Landsnet, the initial shareholders was like a few different entities, including Landsvirkjun, the state energy company. And now it's being transferred more and more. That last little slice of the pie is a municipal utility that is now in a process of like transferring and selling their shares. But initially, a lot of those transmission assets were either pledged or leased to Landsnet. And then over time, it's been sold. There was challenges, and I'm kind of rushing through this a little bit, but basically there were challenges in terms of the way the bonds were structured. Rail Belt Utilities have a similar sort of issue where the debt included, you know, all the assets. It wasn't like split out by individual assets. And so just breaking that out would require kind of renegotiating the bonds or, you know, the debt. So there's a lot of challenges associated with that. So some of the utilities sold their assets immediately to this Landsnet, and some of them leased them and then over time have transferred them. And the reason for leasing them was because it was difficult to break out of all of the assets that they held. So is that relatively correct, Ellie?
Yeah, I think so. I never hit anyone covering this in such a short time, but you did a great job. Regarding that Landsnet, the Iceland TSO is non-profit. That is partly true. They are more. The Icelandic Energy Authority decides what their profit is allowed to be through their weighted average cost of capital. And that reflects also to new investments and so on and so forth, as long-term debt and so on affects the calculation of WACC. So that controls or manages how much they are allowed to charge. So they have been paying dividends to the Icelandic government, but that is just some leftovers or something like that. They are not run, you know, for profit as a capital company or something like that. So otherwise you were just correct.
Thank you.
Okay, well, I tell you what, guys, ladies and gentlemen. We are at 8:56. And we're actually starting to give very short shrift to what in fact was supposed to be the focus of the discussion. I wonder if by the will of the group, if we want to go ahead and find a nice place to pause and maybe come back for a round two. What are we thinking, guys? Again, take
This
yourselves
is a
off mute,
great
by the way.
discussion. I'd go for round two.
Definitely think it's worth a round two. This is Patrice.
Okay. Well, Gwen, I tell you what, is there a good landing spot for a pause, do you think?
Well, I could give a little bit of a teaser for next time and say, because look at, you guys get to see all these like what it actually means on the ground for electrical prices. So that would be, I think, a really fun conversation. But at the end of the day, what I'm interested in kind of talking about is the kinds of policies that actually supported Iceland from moving to where they were to where they are today. And like how, and the conversation that would be fun and a good reason to pause now is to think about like how there are lessons learned or where there's lessons learned for Alaska as we're sort of thinking about our own energy future. So, so yeah, I think this would be a great place to kind of pause and think about when we could have a follow-up conversation about this. So.
Okay. All right. Well, I tell you what, everybody. Yeah, I think let's do that. Is everybody okay with that? All right. Well, Els, I will say, sir, it was been so neat to have you online all the way from Iceland. This was a really excellent historical retrospective. And again, it's neat to find, well, again, that place where Iceland took off, changed the direction is where we actually are right now, with our interesting vulcanized system. All right, well, I tell you what, everybody, we will go ahead and pause here. I will try to reschedule with Ms. Holdmann. How's your schedule next week?
It might work next week.
Oh, wait, no, because we have the defense forum is next week. Isn't it?
No, it's not the weekend.
Not till the week after. I tell you what, I'm going to try a true double up. I'll see if I can't work with Associate Vice Chancellor Holdmann to go ahead and have her as our speaker next week. And so we'll proceed where we've left off for this week. All right, so I'll go ahead and stop sharing. Well, all right, everybody. Yeah, happy Tuesday. This has been amazing. Great conversation. Great to have everybody in the room. So yeah, please know that we are going to try to go ahead and have Gwen here next week, if not at her very next convenience. I don't really have anything scheduled moving forward.
Okay.
So at your leisure, miss, at your leisure. All right. Well, hey, everybody. Yeah, we have a cliffhanger. I don't know if we've ever had a cliffhanger here at the Energy for Alaska Task Force. So, all right, so we will see everyone very, very soon. Have a great rest of your day, rest of your week. If you've not yet, well, I think that we've actually closed registration for the Alaska Defense Forum. However, I believe there are still several sponsorship opportunities if anybody would like to go ahead and try to snatch those up before they finally go away. So again, mark your calendars. Just a reminder, the Alaska Defense Forum will be occurring here in Fairbanks the last week of August, running essentially the main dates are August 29th and 30th with swing activities on both the 28th and the 31st. Also on, I believe it's the 30th or is it the 31st? On the 31st, I sent out the notice to the gang. There's going to be an open house and a Q&A session relative to micro reactors at the university on the evening of the 31st. That's going to be at, I believe, starting at 5 p.m. up in Scheibel Auditorium. So go ahead and check out. I'll be resending that notice, but make sure you get that on your calendars as well. That's a big, big deal. Well, all right, everybody, have a great rest of your day, a great week, and we'll see you very, very soon for the next task force meeting.